Good afternoon, everybody. Kyle Broda here from FullSkillsExamPrep.com, and it's my pleasure to speak with you today. Today we're going to continue on with our lesson on the self-employed category. And even though we touched on the points system a little bit in the previous videos, we're really going to go into detail into this right now. So remember that it's really important to take these larger areas of immigration and divide them up into smaller ones, as this will really help you focus on the areas that you need to study for in order to be successful on your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. If you're following along in the books, you know that the Test Day Data Book has you covered in this area, and of course the exam simulations have questions on this as well. And again, this is just to really get you focused on how to pass your exam. In the seminar, of course, we talk about this thoroughly as well. And as you know, you have these starting points that will help you get some further reading on this topic as well. All right, for today, we have quite a few goals to accomplish as well, and especially to see how these will relate to your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So we're going to learn about that points system and see how it works in the context of potential questions that might be on your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Something important to remember, I've talked about this a couple times already, but it's really essential, is just to remember that the applicant has to meet all of the requirements of the definition of the self-employed person. So it's not just a points system, they have to be able to meet all of these criterion. So relevant experience, just like we talked about before, the intention and ability to be self-employed in Canada, and to make that significant contribution as well. So it's not just points. If the person meets the amount of points, that doesn't mean that they're going to automatically be accepted into the program. And of course, remember that the point system is used so that the agent can have sort of a starting point to see how well the person might be able to become self-employed in Canada in those specified economic activities. All right, so if you take a look at OP8 as well as Regulation 102, you can see that there is this point system over here. It's pretty straightforward, especially if you've studied our lesson on express entry. You'll find that this point system is a lot more straightforward and easier than that. But we're going to go through this in detail anyways, just to, again, make sure you're covered for your exam. Okay, so the feedback that we get from a lot of our clients is that they really love learning about these types of topics through the context of a scenario. So what we're going to do is take a pretty detailed analysis of these points elements and take a look at them through the stories of Donald, Penny, and Roger. So you have your first sample question here. This is on the site as well. And I'll read it to you just in case you're listening to this while doing something else. Okay, we have Donald. So Donald began his career as a broadcast technician straight out of high school when he was offered a 2-year apprenticeship. After his apprenticeship was finished, he was hired by ABC News as a full-time employee for 2 years. Near the end of his contract, he began freelancing a bit for other stations, and 2 years ago, he started supporting himself from his freelance work rather than renewing his contract. He would love to continue this work in Canada and has already begun exploring the market. While he achieved a score of CLB 8 in his English exam and CLB 3 in his French exam, he feels that the agent might think that his age, 48, is too old to become self-supporting. So he would like your advice as to whether or not he would make a good candidate for immigration under the self-employed stream. What would you advise? And then we have our potential answers. So we have A, no, because he does not meet the minimum requirements. We have B, no, because he does not meet the minimum points requirements of 35. We have C, yes, because he meets the requirements and would likely score 60 or more points. And we have D, yes, because he meets the requirements and would likely score between 40 and 50 points. Okay, so if you want to pause the video and read through this thoroughly, that is a good idea. Maybe you even want to try to figure out the answer to this question already and see if you get the correct answer that we will go through at the end of the video. We have our second question here as well. This one is about Penny. So Penny is a master's degree holder who's 35 years old and is considering moving to Canada to continue her self-employment as an interior designer. She explains to you that she started her business as soon as she finished university 4 years ago, and that though at first it was difficult, after a couple of years, the business became profitable enough for her to make a website and share an office with another interior designer. She recently took her IELTS exam and achieved a CLB6, while her TEF level was assessed to be CLB4. She also mentions that she has an aunt who lives in Winnipeg, but she doesn't think she'll see her much since she would like to move to Toronto. How many points would you advise her that she is likely to get in the self-employed system? And with this one, we have 4 options, of course. We have A, which is 80 points, B, which is 70, C, which is 90, and D, which is 60. All right, again, if you want to take a minute. Okay, so if you want to take a minute and pause the video for the previous question, that is perfectly fine. And same with this question as well. So with this question, we have Roger. Roger is a 53-year-old translator from Colombia and would like your opinion about his chances of immigrating to Canada in order to start a translation business. He explains to you that he finished high school and worked in the tourism industry until about 5 years ago, when he started working as a translator for a lawyer for a year. He was initially hired because he speaks English and French perfectly, but also because he has a way of relaying the underlying cultural messages within conversations. After learning all about translating during this first contract, he started his own translation business, which supported himself and his wife, who is also fluent in English and French, for 2 years. Unfortunately, the business did not survive, so Roger has been back to working for the same lawyer for the past 24 months. How many points would you advise him that he is likely to get in the self-employed system? And we have our 4 options here. We have 61. For B, we have 43. For C, we have 54. And for D, we have 51. Okay, so when we take a look at this points grid, which of course you can find in OP8 and in the regulations, you can see that they assess quite a few areas over here. You have education, experience, age, language, and adaptability. The maximum that a person can get is 100 points, and the minimum that a person must get is 35 points. So let's start off with describing the education points. So as you can see over here, the points go up to 25. It's just like a lot of the other immigration classes where a PhD is the highest, as well as a master's degree in this case as well. You have 2 or more university degrees, which is 22. A 3-year diploma, trade certificate, or apprenticeship is at 22 as well. And a university degree of 2 years or more at the bachelor's degree is at 20, as well as a 2-year diploma. Okay, as you go a little bit lower in the points here, you can see that a 1-year university degree with 13 years of full-time study would be 15 points, as well as a 1-year diploma, trade certificate, or apprenticeship as well. And finally, you have a 1-year diploma, trade certificate, apprenticeship with a minimum of 12 years of full-time study, which is at 12 points. And finally, if the person completed high school, he would get 5 points. Okay, so there's a little tip for you as well. And just remember that points are not cumulative. So in this case here, this is just a tiny little example. So we have Donald. Donald graduated from high school after completing grade 12 in 1999, and soon after became a studio musician for a local advertising company that makes radio commercials. During the nights and weekends, he went to the local university and eventually graduated with a 4-year Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in 2003. So when we take a look at this, we can see that he finished high school. He finished grade 12. So that would be the 12 years of study at 5 points. So we can see that Donald finished his degree, his 4-year degree. So that would bring his total years of study up to 16. And with this, we can see that he gets the 20 points for having the bachelor's degree as well. Okay, and you might have noticed that the points says it's at least 14 years of study, but he obviously exceeds that. Okay, so the points that he would get under this one would be 20. It wouldn't be 25. Remember, that's not cumulative. It's the highest degree that reflects the points awarded. Okay, and you can see this in the chart that you have right in front of you. Of course, this is in your test day data book as well. So when we take those important elements of the scenario out of those scenarios, in order to see how it relates to education points, we can see the following information. So we can see with Donald, he began his career straight out of high school. So he finished high school. And then you could tell that he completed his 2-year apprenticeship. For Penny, it's more straightforward. She's a master's degree holder. And for Roger, it's pretty straightforward as well. He completed high school. So when we take a look at this in terms of points, hopefully you got these answers. So you can see with Penny, as we said, she has a master's degree, which is 25 points. Okay, with Donald, he did that 2-year apprenticeship. So that is 20 points. And finally with Roger, he completed high school. So that's 5 points. Now when we go back to our score sheet over here, we can see that it's pretty straightforward when you just plug in the information. So Donald has 20 points for education, Penny has 25, and Roger has 5. Okay, so that covers education. Education is pretty straightforward. And we'll move on into experience. Experience is pretty detailed, and I think that this is probably the most complicated part of the self-employed scoring system. But we're here to help you, of course, so we'll go through this really thoroughly. Okay, so just as we talked about in the previous videos, remember that with experience, the relevant experience has to be 5 years before the date of application. All right, you have this chart as well in Regulation 103. And 2 years of experience is 20 points, 3 years is 25 points, 4 years is 30 points, and 5 years is 35 points, which is the maximum. So we're going to review this just a little bit. We talked about this in the video from yesterday pretty thoroughly, but it's important just because it comes up in the question here, and obviously just cover all your bases for the exam. All right, so experience in terms of time and role. Remember that the person has to have 2 1-year periods of experience in self-employment, in cultural activities, farm management, or athletic. Remember, that's not just generally cultural activities or anything like that. There are specified ones, which you can see in your test day data book. All right, alternatively, for athletes and people engaged in those specified cultural activities, you can have 2 1-year periods of experience in participation at a world-class level. Finally, for people engaged in athletics and cultural activities, they can have a combination of A and B. when we focus specifically on time, we saw this in the previous video as well, that basically we had a lot of different times that they gave us. So May 2012 to July 2013, and in real life, that would be 14 months. But when you're thinking of this in terms of the point system and in terms of Regulation 88, you're thinking of that as 1 year. So remember that 12 months plus 12 months is the requirement. It's not 5 months here, 2 months there. Now, when we take a look at experience as it relates to the questions that we have to answer here, we can see quite a bit of information in here. So with Donald, we can see that the important parts are with his apprenticeship. So after the apprenticeship finished, he was hired as a full-time employee for 2 years and began freelancing as well. So we're going to go through each one of these very thoroughly as well. Penny, you can see that she started her business 4 years ago. And Roger jumped around a little bit as well between being an employee and being self-employed as well. So we'll explore each one of these thoroughly just to really help clarify this. So for Donald, what we're looking at is the time that he spent, and of course, if it was an eligible occupation. If it was an eligible occupation, was he self-employed or at a world-class level? All right, so you can see in your test day data book, and if you want to look at the NOC chart as well, you can see that a broadcast technician is an eligible occupation for experience in the self-employed category. So then we move on into the next part of this, which is seeing the amount of time and the role that he played in this as well. So we can see that he was hired as a full-time employee for 2 years. So even though it is an eligible occupation, he wasn't self-employed in this, and it wasn't at a world-class level as well. All right, we can see that near the end of his contract, he began freelancing. So we'll see how that plays a role in the second element of time that we're going to look at. Okay, so 2 years ago, he started supporting himself from his freelance work. So you can see in there that it's 2 years of self-employment in an eligible occupation, which meets those requirements as well. So because we're focusing on points quite a bit in this video, he would get 20 points under experience for that. If you're still thinking of the definitions, as you should, of course, remember that that's one of those minimum requirements as well. Let's move on to Penny. So she started her business 4 years ago when she finished university, and it became profitable. All right, so what we're doing is looking at the same elements as well, seeing the amount of time, if it's an eligible occupation, and if it is an eligible occupation, was she self-employed or world-class? So this one is an eligible occupation as an interior designer. So then we move on into the next step. We can see that she started this company 4 years ago. And also it's pretty straightforward that during this time, she became self-employed. In the scenario as well, they don't mention anything else really about any other experience or anything like that. So it doesn't play a role in this question, and it's a pretty straightforward answer as well. Okay, so you can see it's an eligible occupation, self-employed, 4 years, so you just add that up to 30 points. When we look at Roger, it's a little bit more complicated as we have to look at 3 sort of elements of his career. So we can see that he worked in the tourism industry until 5 years ago. Working in the tourism industry doesn't really help us with anything, and remember as well that the experience has to be within the last 5 years. But as we carry on in the story, we can see that he began working as a translator for a lawyer. Then he started his own translation business, and he's back to working full-time for the lawyer at this point. So what we're looking at is the occupation. And again, if you look at that chart on page 32 of your test day data booklet, you can see that a translator is an eligible occupation under the self-employed category. And just like I said on the bottom over here, self-employed experience must be within the last 5 years. So that's really, really important. When we take a look at Roger and that first element of his career, you can see that at the beginning he worked for a lawyer for a year as a translator. So with this one here, when we take a look at whether or not it's an eligible occupation, we can see that yes, it is an eligible occupation because it's on that list of eligible occupations. However, this experience would not count because he was an employee. So it wasn't as self-employed. If we take a look at his second gap of his career, we could see that he started a business, a translation business, which supported himself and his wife. And they ran that for 2.5 years. So this would count. Remember that this counts as 2 years, not 3 or not 2.5. And it counts because, of course, it's an eligible occupation. And also he was self-employed. And we can see that in the end, he wound up working for the same lawyer because the business didn't survive. And he's been doing that for the past 18 months. So for this one as well, you're looking at him and he's an employee of this lawyer. So even though he is performing an eligible occupation, he is not self-employed for that 1 year and not at a world-class level either. So we can see that the only one that would count in here is the 2 years as a self-employed translator. And that would give him the 20 points that he would need for eligibility to the self-employed class. And also remember, in order to meet those definitional requirements, he would need at least 2 years experience as a self-employed person in an eligible occupation. When we go back to our points grid now, we can see that we're filling this up pretty nicely. So Donald gets an extra 20, Penny gets an extra 30 points, and Roger gets an extra 20 as well. Let's move on into the age requirements. So the age gives the person 10 points in there as well. And remember, there's a minimum score that people need for the overall score, which is 35 points. So a lot of people get tricked into this because they think, oh, if a person has 5 years of experience, then they would be accepted. But remember that points are just one little part of what is used to assess if a person can apply under the self-employed category. With age, you can see in Regulation 102 that we have this grid. That's pretty helpful, pretty straightforward as well. And when we relate this to our stories of Donald, Penny, and Roger, we can see that, again, it's pretty straightforward. Donald is 48, Penny is 35, and Roger is 53. So if you want to take a minute, I don't think it would take you a minute, but just take a few seconds, really. And you can look this up on page 32 of your test day data book to see how many points they would likely get under age. When we look at Donald, we can see that he is 48 years old. So this would put him at 10 points. He would get the maximum. All right, when we take a look at Penny, you can see that she's got the same thing. So the same amount of points, even though quite a difference in age, but the same amount of points. And finally, with Roger, he is 53 years old, so he only gets 2 points for age. Okay, for age, that was pretty straightforward. So as we can see, Donald has 10 points, Penny has 10, and Roger has 2 now. let's move on into language ability. So this is a pretty big topic as well. And you'll see a lot of the information in this little session will translate to other areas of immigration where language is required as well. You can see in the points here that when you look online under the self-employed category, they give this general statement here where they say a high level, a moderate level, a basic level, and no language ability. An easier way to look at this, of course, is just to give it a CLB score. So for a high level, that's a CLB 8 and more. A moderate level is CLB 6 and 7. A basic level is CLB 4 and 5. And no language ability is considered to be CLB 0 to 3. When you take a look at this in relation to the language exams accepted for immigration, remember that IELTS, TEF, and CELPIP are the only ones accepted. And if you're looking at a CLB 8 or more, those individual scores within each exam play a large role, even though in this question it didn't. So for CLB 8 or more, the minimum that they could get in IELTS would be a 7.5 in listening, a 6.5 in reading, a 6.5 in writing, and in speaking as well. For TEF, the minimum that they would be able to get if they wanted to get those points for high language proficiency would be a 280 in listening, 233 in reading, 349 in writing, and 349 in speaking. When we move on into CELPIP, CELPIP is more straightforward. It's just 8 or higher in each category. If we're looking at moderate language proficiency, which would be 16 points maximum for both languages, what we're looking at in here is in IELTS a 5.5 to a 6 in listening, for reading a 5 to a 6, and in writing and speaking it's the same as listening, so 5.5 to a 6. For TEF, you have a 217 to 279 for listening. In reading, you have a 181 to 232, and writing you have a 271 to 348. With speaking, it is a 271 to 348. And finally, in CELPIP, it's just a 6 to 7 in everything. For low language proficiency, in IELTS, you have a 4.5 to 5 in listening. For writing and speaking, it's 4 to 5. And reading, you have 3.5 to 4. For TEF, you have 145 to 216. You have 121 to 180 in reading, 181 to 270 in writing, and in speaking, 181 to 270 as well. And for CELPIP, just 4 to 5 in everything as well. What they consider to be no language proficiency is a 0 for IELTS, all the way up to a 4 in listening. In reading, a 0 to 3. Writing, a 0 to a 3.5. Speaking, a 0 to a 3.5. And in TEF, you have a 0 to 144 in listening. With reading, you have a 0 to 120. Writing, a 0 to 180. And speaking, you have a 0 to 180 as well. In CELPIP, it is anything between 0 and 3 for each one. When we go back and see how this relates to our self-employed candidates, we can see that we have CLB 8 for Donald in English and CLB 3 in French. For Penny, CLB 6 for English, and CLB 4 for French. And with Roger, they just give us a more general statement. They say he speaks English and French perfectly, though of course he'll need a language exam if he wants to immigrate. So when we take a look at this chart, it's very easy to follow. This is in your test day data book, of course, on page 33. And I've got a couple tips for you as well. So remember that the highest score becomes the first language, because that way, obviously, the person would get more points. And the second tip is you're going to have to connect the dots in a lot of questions. In a lot of the simulation questions that we give you with the books, you have this sort of method. In this one, of course, we're just saying CLB 8, CLB 6, but really it's a good idea to learn how to connect those dots. So if someone gets an IELTS band 6, what is the CLB? How many points is the CLB worth in the self-employed category for this one? When we take a look at these points with relation to Donald, we could see that Donald achieved a score of CLB 8 in his English exam and CLB 3 in his French exam. With this, you can see how many points that he would get. And we can see that his CLB 8 is 16 points. Meanwhile, his CLB 3 is 0 points. So his total for language is 16. With Penny, we could see that she took her IELTS exam and achieved a CLB 6, and her TEF level was a CLB 4. So we can see that with the CLB 4 in French, she gets 2 points. And with the CLB 6 in English, she gets 8 points. Finally, with Roger, he speaks both English and French perfectly. So we can see that he would get the maximum amount of points in language, though obviously he'll have to take a language exam no matter what. That concludes the language portion of this. So we can see that now when we look at the scores, Donald has 16, Penny has 10, and Roger has 24 out of language. Let's move on into adaptability. So that is Regulation 104. So adaptability focuses on a few areas. It's usually something to do with a Canadian connection, and also, as you can see in this chart, the person's spouse or common law. So with this, you can see that a person who is bringing a husband or wife or common law partner, what they're going to do is take a look at the education according to Regulation 104. They will also take a look at previous work in Canada, previous study in Canada as well, and relatives in Canada. When we take a look at this adaptability in relation to the scenarios that we have with Donald, Penny, and Roger, you can see that with Donald, there really isn't any information given as per how his situation would relate to those adaptability points. With Penny, we can see that she has an aunt in Winnipeg, and Roger has a wife who's also fluent in English and French. So let's see how those play a role in the adaptability points. Okay, with Roger, we can see that his wife is fluent in English and French. However, there aren't any points given in this area for his wife. If they mention that his wife has a PhD or master's degree or studied in Canada or something like that, that'd be pretty different. But in this case, they don't really give anything for this, according to Regulation 104. With Penny, though, we could see that she has an aunt who lives in Winnipeg. All right, and you can see at the bottom here with relatives in Canada. So the applicant has an aunt who's residing in Canada, and that would give her the 5 points. Now, when we go back and we take a look at our final scores, we can see that Donald didn't achieve any points on that adaptability area, and same with Roger, and Penny got 5 in there. So the grand total for each of these people is Donald has 66 points, Penny has 80, and Roger has 51. In conclusion, if you chose C when we started this video as the correct answer, congratulations. It's a skill to add up all those points and everything like that, so congratulations on that. With Penny, if you chose 80, then that means you're really on the right track as well. Finally, with Roger, if you chose 51 points, good for you. Again, you're on the right track to passing your exam. And if you didn't choose that or you chose the wrong answer, that's not a problem either. That's what these videos are for. It's just to help you get the correct answer next time. Okay, so you can see that with these final points, it plays a role. It's really step-by-step in this as well. And the test day data book will help you quite a bit with this. Of course, remember that these points are not the only requirement for somebody to be accepted as a self-employed person in Canada. You have to take a look at the ability, the intent, everything like that as well. But this is just there to help cover you in this points area. A very big thank you. It's been my pleasure to help you out today with the point system in the self-employed category. So my name is Kyle Broda, of course, and I'm here as part of the team of FullSkillsExamPrep.com. And just like Full Skills Exam Prep is here to help you pass your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, we have a whole group of people who are helping RCICs in Canada all the time as well. So be sure to go to the sponsors page of our website and take a look at what each one can offer you, just because they're great companies, we use them, and they're there to help you as well. All right, so again, have a really great afternoon, and talk to you soon.